Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jake Milstein. This is the urgent panel discussion about the water system breach in the Tampa area. Um, I'm going to kill some time here while we let people get in the room. Um, a lot of people signing in here. So, obviously, this is a major issue, something that some folks predicted, but now it happened. So we wanted to get everybody together to talk about how it happened, to talk about how to avoid it in the future, to sort of get together and talk about what we know, what we don't know, and uh, uh, you know, uh, one of the things we've found when we've done these panels before, when there have been other kinds of breaches, is one of the things that happens is that in the chat, and if there's a chat on the right hand side there, folks also have a place where they can talk to each other. Folks who they don't necessarily know, and that's generally helpful. Um, the One of the questions Mark just asked, will this webinar be recorded and available? Yeah, if you register, the system will send you an email with the recording, and we're also going to put a recording up on YouTube and put a link to it on our website, ci.security. So yes, absolutely. So if you have folks on your team who registered but didn't but can't attend, they'll still get a recording of it, and we'll also email out the recording on our website. It's 11:02, so I'll get started here. So the folks on the panel today are Mike Hamilton, who's the CI Security co-founder and former CISO of the city of Seattle, Fred Langston, also co-founder of CI Security and EVP of Professional Services, Bjorn Townsend, who's a water system security consultant and incident response expert, and Dan Irvin, executive VP at Various and facility designer. One of the things that we'll do today is, ask them a bunch of questions. If you have questions for them, please put those questions in the chat. I'll make sure to ask them, or we'll respond to them in the chat to make sure we're covering all the bases. Make sure you get all your questions answered. And at the very end of this, I have an ask of everybody, which is we do a fair number of these, and we'd love your opinion on how it was, and we give away gift cards for people who fill out a survey. So I'll put the survey link in the chat. And this is not a marketing or selling thing. So that's not what we're here to do. We're here, our company's mission is to protect life-saving, life-sustaining services, and getting everyone together and helping avoid this kind of thing is what we're all about. So here's what we know so far. The attack happened in Oldsmar, Florida, near Tampa, a city with 15,000 people. It was the Friday before the Super Bowl in Tampa. An employee noticed somebody was controlling his computer, but thought it was a supervisor. 5.5 hours later, the same employee saw different programs opening and the level of sodium hydroxide, being raised from 100 parts per million to more than 11,000 parts per million. The intruder left the system, and the employee brought the levels back down. Oldsmar disallowed remote access at this point, which was initially set up so supervisors could troubleshoot issues without being on location. The remote access was through TeamViewer, which is a program that allows that. And police say they don't have any suspects. So, the first question here is, seeing those facts, Mike, let's start with you. Seeing those facts, what does that make you think?
So the first thing it makes me think is just to let you know, I was right when I kept talking about how important a flushing toilet is. Okay. Okay. I know you thought that was a joke, but when it comes to the infrastructure that is critical at the scale you actually live your life, you get it when something happens. So it just, to kind of recap on what we know and maybe just add a little color to that. So yeah, it was TeamViewer, but a whole lot of information has to come out still, because we don't know if this was a vulnerability that was exploited in TeamViewer. We don't know if it was an easily guessed password. We don't know that it was no password. They just had it out there hanging open for anybody to trip over it and find it. I'm sure somebody did a Shodan search or something like that and found it real easily and walked in. So, as more information comes out, it will tell us something about the motivation of the actor and potentially, the taxonomy of that actor. But the take home from the evidence that we have right now is that this was apparently pretty easy to do. Again, it may come out that somebody used some kind of sophisticated exploit to, bust open TeamViewer. My money's on no. My money's on this was lame password. If it points to, it's highly suggestive of an unsophisticated actor, a crime of opportunity. And I'll give you just like two pieces of information that you can compare to for other things have happened. So number one, a serious and sophisticated actor would have obfuscated the HMI, right? So the human machine interface, the thing that's got the little cartoon showing you how all the industrial control systems are all working. Before, when things like this have happened and it was, nation state level, they took that over and they made it so that it would show everything's fine. No matter what was going on, it would show everything was fine. So they did not do anything to obfuscate the HMI. They also didn't do anything to gain persistence. This was a drive-by. Hey, look what I got. Here, let me fiddle around with this thing. Oh, I better get out of here. I think that's what happened here. A sophisticated actor would have tried to gain persistence if the intent was really, to knock down a water utility, and potentially poison people. So, I think everybody's bacon here got saved by the layered controls. There was an aware operator, and they even said, this water would not, if they had increased the pH of this water to 10, it's not going out, to drinking water pipes. There is analytical testing before it goes out. Dan knows a lot more than myself about that, but just on the low end, that's my analysis of what happened, pursuant on getting more information. The Secret Service and the FBI are in there right now.
Yeah. So Jesse asked, was this done during off hours? No, it was done during daylight hours on Friday. Dan, you've designed facilities. Could this have sickened people?
It's unlikely that it would have. There are, of course, exceptions to every situation, but the injection of essentially lye in this particular instance over a relatively short period of time at a high rate, there's enough dilution, most likely, and I'm not aware of the specific layout of this plant or the distribution system downstream. But generally speaking, there's enough of a piping network and enough of a transmission, distribution, and storage network downstream that you wouldn't see an immediate health risk from this. It's a relatively low risk event in that it's very likely, even if an operator had not been there watching the cursor, it's unlikely this would have been a public health emergency before it had been noticed by another means and corrected. And I think that's fairly common in the water supply and water distribution area. Regardless of how sophisticated our control systems become and how complicated they become, if you're in a distribution system, for example, and the pressure is low, you start getting calls from customers that their pressure is low generally before taps are running dry. If pressure is high, the same kind of thing. You've got a funny taste, potentially. I'm not trying to downplay the risk or say there aren't scenarios that are potentially a significant hazard, but generally speaking, our water systems are fairly robust in that regard. And even though we've installed controls and situations to minimize the costs of O&M in operation and make that easier, our systems are pretty robust and safe.
So, Jared asked a question in the chat there, and I want to ask the group here. There's some chatter about whether, this happened obviously the Friday before the Super Bowl. Was it a mistake to not divulge it until after the Super Bowl? If this had been an actor that had wanted to then go attack other water systems, should other water systems, other cities been notified? Or was it okay to wait because it looked like an unsophisticated actor?
I'm going to say that this is not the first water system in the U.S. that's been attacked. The Russians actually went after, I believe, a system in Illinois in November. So I don't think any of us really thought about that or heard much about that when that happened. I don't think that this is necessarily any different other than the Super Bowl happened to be in Tampa. And I don't know that that changes the threat horizon here, and the fact that they were not successful and they took a relatively unsophisticated tact. I don't think it's any different than attacks that are happening all over the internet, all over the country right now against all sorts of companies, right? This is the same type of attack that they would use to do other things, like do business email compromise, take over other systems on the network and use them for crypto mining. What they did here was very public, and there may be a reason for something very public like that. But most people that would exploit this vulnerability are going to go in and make some money with it. And I'm still not convinced that this person or these people are not still trying to find ways to monetize this activity. I don't think we really know the extent of what's happened. We're working on a very limited set of data. They could still have persistence in there. They could have plenty of ways to get out. We know that water systems are not, you still find phone modems connected to water systems. That is not out of, we don't see it everywhere else, but we still see it there. There are other ways that you could still build backdoors in that shutting off that remote access may not be enough.
And, and so when you think about, the fact that this happened before, Fred and Mike, you've both warned about this exact thing. In fact, Mike, you wrote an article about it on our blog like several years ago, and I'll put a link in the chat. And Fred, you went on TV and warned about this.
Yeah, 5 years ago, I was on the local TV station up here in Seattle demonstrating using Shodan, the tool that most of these people go and poke around and look for these sorts of utilities. And we connected to a water system in Brazil that had an open telnet port and was known to have root as its passwords. It was connected to a chlorinator. It was on TV. They were watching me do everything legal right up to the point of doing something illegal to show how easy this was. And it was about 10 minutes. The whole segment was 10 minutes to do all this. So there was nothing magical, frankly, about that demonstration. And this has one tiny layer on top of it. It's got TeamViewer. And when you look beyond that, it was a Windows 7 system, apparently, that was running the management system. That's end of life. We know that. There are no security patches still. I mean, you get an extended end of life contract, I believe, but it's right at the end of really what you should be using. So yeah, there's a lot more to this.
And very quickly, because somebody asked before, not everybody knows what Shodan is. Could you give a 10-second Shodan?
It's basically Google for infrastructure and IT assets exposed on the internet. It's very, very useful for looking for critical infrastructure like water systems, SCADA systems. When you look outside the United States, it becomes really apparent that the front door is open on a significant amount of these.
And Sean asked in the chat, to Mike's point about their potential level of password security on control systems, what security standards are enforced at minimum to ensure critical infrastructure is protected at a base level? And Bjorn, you and I were talking just a couple of days ago about that very thing, about, what are the regulations here?
Yeah. So the tricky part is that the water industry has only relatively received regulation as far as cybersecurity. The America's Water Infrastructure Act was enacted in 2018. And so only for about a year and a half has there been any requirement to do a cybersecurity assessment of the water systems here in the US. And so most water systems are still in the process of performing those assessments. I'm actively working on 4 separate water systems right now to assess their security. And there's a lot of catching up to do because that regulation wasn't there in the past. It's a very under-recognized risk. And my concern is that really, there hasn't been a standard applied. There hasn't been a bar set for where you need to move your security to. There is no maturity model like the CMMC is being worked on for the Department of Defense. There is no water system security maturity model. And there might kind of need to be, because right now there is no way of sort of level setting where one water system is on that road. There is just what the America's Water Infrastructure Act, they're called risk and resiliency assessments, and really what they have you do is more think in terms of things that could happen as opposed to things that you're supposed to be doing. You're looking at, you're being asked to the question of, how could an earthquake affect the water system? How could a breach of the financial controls affect the water system? You're not being like prescriptively told you must have strong passwords that follow DoD requirements. You must have multi-factor authentication enabled. And by the way, even more than password requirements, multi-factor authentication is the key to a lot of those remote access issues. Standards like that are things that we kind of need to think about at this juncture because of events like this.
And even though the water industry is now moving towards a greater awareness of cybersecurity and the ramifications of that, I think as an industry, they're going to have a relatively difficult time compared to others, because there is no regulatory oversight on the business practices and the technical practices of each utility that would tend to facilitate either a one-size-fits-all approach to security or a standardization of what's a good model. Some water systems are more highly funded in operations and maintenance, and some of them are more highly funded in capital projects, for example. And the difference between those can have significant impacts on how you would build and maintain a secure system from a cyber standpoint. So whereas, for example, the electrical power industry is a much more regulated business environment, the concept of standardization on security, I think, is easier to implement there than it is in the variety of water systems and the plethora of policies and approaches towards their business that would tend to make that an easier thing to implement.
Yeah, let me jump in a little bit too and just kind of lay out how the food chain works in regulating critical infrastructure. So Homeland Security has this construct that they call critical infrastructure, and they've identified initially 19 sectors, and I think it's down to 16. Monuments aren't that important apparently anymore. And every one of those critical sectors has a government coordinating council, a sector coordinating council. They're supposed to have an ISAC, an information sharing and analysis organization, and they have what's called a sector specific agency, an SSA. So the sector specific agency for the water sector, which also includes irrigation, wastewater, stormwater removal is part in there too. The SSA is the EPA. And historically, the EPA has only so they have regulatory authority over the water sector for infrastructure protection, okay? And they've never exercised that. The only regulatory authority to date that the EPA has ever exercised is in terms of water purity, drinking water purity, right? So, and now, because the federal government came out with the NIST framework, and I agree with Dan 100%, one size does not fit all. But the sector-specific agencies are starting to look at the NIST cybersecurity framework as their kind of benchmark starting point, because it's an outcome-driven framework, right? It doesn't say have this control in place. It says make this thing happen. However you do that is up to you. And so the Coast Guard then has authority over stuff like maritime ports, and they're going, okay, with your facility security plan, we want to see an assessment against the NIST framework. And now they've come out with the AWIA, which is just an assessment framework. It's kind of a risk assessment. It doesn't try to line you up with anything, but I think there's more coming, and I think it's going to be based on that NIST framework.
Well, I want to point out too, you mentioned the ISAC, the water ISAC, which is one of the agencies that really is trying to set standards for the water industry. And they have some great tools. they're built for an immature audience, right? I mean, if you really want to mature your program, you're going to have to go above and beyond that. And then this framework is certainly a great place to target. But the Water ISAC is go to their website, use some of their tools, their guidance materials, and at least give you an idea of what other people in that in the water field are doing, because these people on ISAC is an information sharing organization. So it's people like you that are all communicating together on how to handle these problems.
Well, and so I want to go back to the assessments. Bjorn, this is true at anything. Not every assessment is created equal, right? I mean, so the AWIA says you have to have this assessment. They're getting the assessment. So two questions. One, how do you tell if you're going to get a good assessment, or at least a good quality assessment rather, and then second, does it say that people have to follow up and fix the things?
Yeah. So in terms of making sure that you're getting a good assessment, you want to make sure that as you're writing the contract for that, you want to make sure that you have provisions for talking to your people, for interviewing kind of every sector of your business. You want to make sure that this assessment is not just focusing on the way that your systems are networked together. It's not just focusing on how physically secure your buildings and facilities are. It's looking at your financial controls. The risk of business email compromise has been growing ever higher, and a water system can be compromised because it loses money to fraud. And that can, disrupt a water system as well. The America's Water Infrastructure Act has specific provisions requiring you to look at those risks. The same goes for human resources departments. You want to be making sure that assessment is talking to your HR department to make sure that your background check policies and practices are up to snuff. You want to make sure that that data is being handled, stored, and retained properly, because that's personal information. Often personal health information is included, and that can also be a financial and reputational risk to your water system if that information is lost. And most importantly, I think you want to make sure that you're getting an assessment that is holistic. It's looking at the entire water system in both its physical and logical or cyber aspects, and most particularly at the places where those two things interact. Wherever you see a control system, you're probably going to find that it's hooked up to a network, because control systems need to coordinate with one another. They need to be able to talk back and forth across widely distributed areas. And even if you may think that a device has nothing to do with a network connection, you might be surprised when you dig deeper into how it relays its information and what it touches. And you want to make sure that your assessment is asking those questions. Your assessor is going around and physically inspecting pumping stations and looking at how the equipment is physically secured, but also what it is physically proximate to. Make sure that they're looking at it in context so that they understand, okay, yeah, there's this locked box here that's full of equipment. How could somebody use objects in this environment to access it, get into it, get it open, and tamper with it? Lots of things to consider, and you want to be global in how you approach it.
And Bjorn, and real quick, Bjorn, you were just telling a story about a water system that didn't really realize it was connected to the internet.
Yeah, there was a water system that I was talking to relatively recently in which it's kind of a similar situation to what you had in Florida, where they were the water system supervisor was doing remote administration because of COVID, and they noted that their SCADA systems were not connected to any network. And I said, well, if that's true, you mentioned that you monitor the systems via a device in your office. How are you able to connect to those systems? He said, well, I use GoToMeeting, and that is certainly a service that works over the internet. So, these are there is internet in the picture, is what I'm trying to say. Even if you don't necessarily think that things are hooked up that way, that's kind of how all this ties together.
And Dan, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Well, I think the question you ask is such a good one, Jake, and it's an extremely hard one, I think, for most water system operators and management to answer, and that is, how do you know if you have a good AWIA assessment? And the analogy I would make is this: is as a facility designer, let's assume I designed a water treatment plant, but I locked the door and the owner were never allowed to go in. But I routinely remind them that they've got the best water treatment plant in the land. You know, if somebody were to ask them, do you have a good water treatment plant? They'd say, yeah, we have the best in the land. But how do they know? You know, and I think that the IT, the SCADA, and the cybersecurity world is very much like that, analogous to that, I think, from an owner standpoint, in that we may have had a company do an assessment. We may have had that done with our own staff. We may have had it done by a compatible IT department who may have given us a thumbs up or a clean bill of health. But the question is, they don't know what they don't know. And how do we know that they were either qualified? And I'm not implying that somebody isn't qualified who's doing that, but to the how broad-based are they? How deeply did they dive? How knowledgeable were they of the subtleties? That's really hard to know without a second opinion. And I've been advising almost all of my clients to get a second opinion, to do it with two agencies or two groups, not because one of them may not be qualified or may not do a good job, but two sets of eyes and ears in that environment, I think, are good insurance.
As an assessor, it's strongly my preference to have another set of eyes, because assessors are only human, and things can be missed, and we all think in different ways. We have different backgrounds and we see different things. Having diverse sets of eyes really helps too.
Right.
I'd also want to toss in that there are 6 specific points that are actually called out in the AWI risk and resiliency approach. And what I see occasionally lacking is the people interpreting these 6 points. They think, cybersecurity may only apply to the one like risk to system from malevolent acts and natural hazards, when in fact things like the financial infrastructure and the monitoring practices, which most people don't think are even part of cybersecurity, are critical components. So you want to make sure that your assessment methodology covers all 6 areas, and it will help you when you think about what is important from a cybersecurity perspective to understand that things you may not normally consider having cybersecurity implications do.
In fact, we recently had a comment come out of risk and resiliency assessment that the servers were in a room that had overhead piping up above the suspended ceiling. And what if one of those pipes was to break? You know, that may not be a normal scope item in many cyber analysts' investigations, but certainly is a significant component of that investigation.
Yeah, that's resilience for sure. Fred, you brought up the importance of monitoring. You know, in these OT, industrial control systems, SCADA, whatever you want to call it, environments, it's not the same traffic moving around, right? There's decom, Modbus. I mean, there's these protocols that we don't normally look at. In your experience, Dan, in building out these plants, is there historically generally thought given during the design process as to how we're going to monitor all this stuff going on? And I know it's operational monitoring is a really big deal. Is security monitoring ever a component of that?
Yes, almost always. So, whether it's a sensor on a finished water line, in the case of Florida, for example, was there a separate pH sensor on the finished water line as it was leaving the plant? In almost all of these systems, there is at least the capability, well, at least the designers have designed in the capability to have a backup or a second check, or a gate, a fail-safe, for example. Now, to the extent that all of those are used is generally then an operations and maintenance issue, and I can't say that I'm an expert in how operating plants or operating systems morph over time to become more convenient or less costly, in the eyes of the owners. But most systems have that capability built in.
Yeah, good. Well, that's comforting. It's when we talk about, the potential for what could have happened here and the fact that, high pH water probably would have gone out. I'm going to go back to this. If this actor was more of a terrorist than a looky-loo, with a Super Bowl right there, chlorine gas is a whole lot more deadly than water that's never going to make it to your faucet. And, when I have served in Homeland Security councils and things like that, this is a big topic of discussion, is the chlorine that's held in processing plants and how toxic that is if somebody decides, it's possible to overpressurize it, blow it up, whatever, even if it's some kind of kinetic means. So again, I just don't think that this particular instance, this was, nobody was intent on terrorism here. Some of the other things that I have heard, though, especially in waste treatment, overpressurizing a digester can be a real messy explosion. I've read about that. Irrigation districts and frankly dams too. Get a hold of the SCADA system. You can create a water hammer, which is fairly destructive. Opening and closing valves at the right frequency. And I have been out to the Boundary Dam after they had right. So that's kind of at the intersection of Washington, Idaho, and Canada. And they had a piece of equipment, a Schweitzer relay failed. They don't know why. It wasn't supposed to. There was some suspicion that somebody had fed it the string of bytes to make it freak out and do whatever it did, but they had to shed load, right? They had to dump electricity into the ground to avoid, frying Seattle. So, I mean, stuff like this has actually happened. I'm interested in the other exposures out there too, because, and I don't know if Bjorn, if this has been part of your assessment methodology. I know that you're constrained by this AWIA methodology, but isn't there a bunch of field telemetry out there that has to lead back, right? We need to know the level of the water in wells.
Absolutely. There is a tremendous amount of that information. In fact, that's a lot of what I see.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these systems are mainly, they're designed kind of as a security measure, not to allow you to modify them remotely. None of the SCADA systems in many of the systems that I've looked at are actually like hooked up to chemical diffusers. They're not releasing any of that sodium hydroxide. What they're actually doing is monitoring reservoir levels and making sure that it doesn't overflow and that it doesn't get too low. Or it's related to the water quality testing process, and they have telemetry basically from not from cradle to grave, but from source to customer, the person who's drinking it, making sure that water quality is being maintained end to end. There's the risk that and this is something that I would be pretty concerned about, the risk that there may be a more subtle, not in this case, but there may be a more subtle play going on. Like, what if you change the readings that people who are looking at these systems are getting, so that they think that they're seeing good quality water when in fact water quality is dropping? What if levels are changed to encourage bacterial growth instead of discourage it? We're looking at pH levels. We're not sending samples out to a lab to like count the protozoans and see exactly what bacteria is growing in it continuously all the time. That's not practical. So, like in the case of Florida, one question I'd have for Dan would be, what would have happened if they'd set those levels to 0 and nobody noticed? Like, would that encourage bacterial growth in that system? Would it, distort the safety or quality of the water at all if the level went down instead of up? That sort of thing.
And I would say it depends, Bjorn. I don't know enough about that treatment plant to know why they were adjusting pH, right? It may have been to make another part of the process more efficient. or it may have actually been to provide direct impact on the quality of the water. I just don't know enough to know, but certainly both of those are possible. I think the risk with Florida is looking at the specifics there and translating that to our own systems and trying to protect against that, right? I think the bigger advantage there is just recognizing that there was a compromise and then looking at how our systems might also be compromised, but maybe not in such analogous or specific ways. You talk about, for example, what a hacker or somebody might do to impact the system. What if it wasn't water quality related at all? But they artificially drove down the amount of water that's billed, and you bankrupt the system because they're not collecting enough revenue, right? How long would that take? Maybe a couple of years. What would happen in the interim? What kind of other controls are in place before you find that? That's actually very unlikely that would actually happen, because somebody would discover somewhere along the way that things just weren't adding up and you would discover it. But my point is, there are subtleties embedded in the compromise that we should be aware of and not get too focused on the specifics of that compromise.
Absolutely.
Even insofar as, and again, this goes back to the one size fits all. And I had 2 back-to-back phone conversations with clients yesterday. And in one of those, I had a client asking to upgrade a variable frequency drive to a unit that would connect to the internet and give them advanced operating data. And I had another client who was actively pulling his SCADA system off the internet and making direct point-to-point connections in the system, right? So here we have 2 clients heading in completely opposite directions. And you can't say that one of those was right and one of those was wrong, because it all depends on what other infrastructure surrounds each one of those discussions and each one of those decisions. In the case of the client who's pulling off the internet, the impact there is they're going to have less operational flexibility, which may mean they have higher costs in the way of operators and oversight. In the case of the client who was putting in a more sophisticated motor starter, they're going to need more cybersecurity analysis and more sophisticated network control capabilities. So, none of these are good decisions or bad decisions in a vacuum. They're all related to the rest of the infrastructure. And it's just the awareness of where the vulnerabilities are that I think is really where the advantage in this conversation lies.
Well, forgive this pun before I use it, but it's if this is a high profile attack because it happened right before the Super Bowl, is that some people have called this a watershed moment. I'm sorry. But in all seriousness, does this happening with all eyes on it, being on the front page of the New York Times and everything, Dan, does this change your advice to people as a facility designer?
Absolutely. I think that, and I have some sense and maybe some reason to believe that as our workforce ages, and that as more of the operators and managers who are used to designing and operating systems without sophisticated remote controls kind of leave the industry, I think possibly there is less emphasis placed on the importance of facility design being foolproof as opposed to the control system being foolproof. And what I mean by that, and I'll use an analogy, I'll use an example that probably isn't accurate, but it will make the point. Why did the injection equipment in Florida have the capability to inject 11,000 parts per million of chemical into the system? Was that necessary? If the most you would ever need was 500, the mechanical process should not have been capable of being adjusted above that. Now, again, I know nothing about Florida to know if that's actually a good analogy, but I think the point still stands, and that is that operators, designers, I think, should be aware of kind of the strategies and the approaches used before there were such sophisticated automatic controls, and not lose sight of the benefits of those, because I think then automatic controls and remote access can be a much more helpful thing and a less destructive thing.
Yeah.
Less potentially destructive anyway.
Sure. Mike, same question to you. And Bjorn, you're about to go out and do another assessment,
Yeah, like right after this.
Right after this call, yeah.
right after this call. Yes, that timing is quite. So, does this happening, and this being, such a public thing, does this change your discussions at this point?
Go ahead, Bjorn.
Oh, absolutely. This makes it much easier. So, one of the problems that I frequently run into when assessing a water system is that the people who run that water system are skeptical that there is a need to assess the cybersecurity of that system. They're not sure that this is really a risk. Events like this prove it. In many cases, the water systems that I'm dealing with are very, very similar to the situation that we're seeing here. They have the same risks, the same openings and vulnerabilities, and it has to change the conversation because this is a real threat and real examples. It's happening. It's happening all around us, and it can't be ignored. One thing that is really important to remember, though, is that these water systems are bound by really painfully tight budgets. There is no funding for cybersecurity really at the municipal level or for the level of water systems, and there urgently needs to be. Congress needs to act, and it needs to act now, or there will never be money for the steps to be taken.
Well, so in the chat, Brian brought this up. There are a lot of municipalities that just, they don't have this. They're listening to you guys. They're saying, "Wow, that sounds expensive." How should they move forward? What should they do, Fred?
So I think it's about having a prioritized roadmap and figuring out what things are going to have the most impact to starting to lock down the hatches. And multi-factor authentication, and frankly, anything that allows remote access, that's where you should probably be spending a big part of your money, both tightening it down, monitoring it 24/7, 365 to make sure you know what's happening.
Don't buy cheap firewalls.
Yeah, and actually there's a more mature approach that other industries use where they actually use not just a VPN, or TeamViewer in. They use an intermediary server. They usually call it jump server, in which they control all this access and they monitor closely, and they can actually run keystroke loggers in case somebody did click the wrong button in configuring the amount of chemicals going in. Even if it was an honest mistake, you can replay that and find out where that mistake was made and fix it. So other industries have implemented not very costly solutions. It's basically a RDP server or a Citrix server that you've hardened and put a lot of controls on and use multi-factor. But TeamViewer is a good product. It just gives you a direct connection all the way in. You need more stops along the way to vet what's happening.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I just want to be really mindful of the whole, local government, municipal utilities, public utilities don't have any money. So we can say, do an assessment, get your corrective action plan, work through it, right? Probably the cheapest, fastest thing anybody could do right now is hire somebody to go try and break in, show me where we're blowing it. Do a penetration test specifically against your operational technology environment, which hopefully is disjoint, if not air-gapped, from your IT environment. And just have somebody, if you have any warts, if there's an easy way in, have somebody find that for you. And yeah, go through the process of getting your assessment, getting your corrective action plan, and working through that over time, getting multi-factor, do all that stuff. But in the short term, know if there's a hole big enough for a truck to drive through.
And one of the questions that's coming up in the chat here is what should we use? Log me in, TeamViewer, VPN, on and on and on. I mean, is there a recommendation you all have?
It's a business decision to make. One size does not fit all.
Right. And it's about how you build it, right? All these products can be implemented in a secure fashion. It's a matter of if you've done all the work it takes to make that secure. And if you're implementing the other things that go with it, like multi-factor authentication, which we just can't stop saying because it's that important. You know, if that's part of your TeamViewer implementation and you've got all the right things, you know, tightened down, you can use it.
It doesn't matter if the password is on a Post-it note on somebody's monitor.
That's right.
You know, you know, another question about money. You know, Dan, I know you've worked with, you know, local governments for years, and Mike used to be the CISO for the city of Seattle. You know, when these things happen, one of the things that IT and I see there are a lot of people in the audience who are IT directors and not a lot of mayors, or not a lot of county executives. You know, does this kind of thing, you know, how you know, without sounding like the scary person, how do you take this to the city council, county council, whoever your people are?
Go ahead, Mike.
Apparently, Mike, you have something to say.
I'd say go to the utility commission and say we need to raise our rates a little bit to pay for some damn security. They'll do it. I mean, it's hard to get the utility commission to allow anybody to raise rates unless you have a super good reason. Super good reason. Just smacked everybody with a 2x4.
Well, and in the Pacific Northwest, where this set of panelists anyway is currently sitting, there is a local water utility who recently had multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars of expenses to respond to one of these events. That helps, right? So, I mean, having an example where people know the names of the people working in that organization is a big help. But that is the challenge. You know, Bjorn was right. Most municipal water systems, anyway, have some budget, but not as much budget as they would like. So they're prioritizing, and the simple strategic steps in this arena are simply re-engaging priorities. It's what are the benefits of an ongoing main replacement program, and what are the risks if you take budget from that and apply it to an update in cybersecurity, and what are the benefits to doing that? You know, that's a simple cost benefit analysis based on some really complex assumptions about what's the likelihood, what's the risk, and what are the impacts. Now, in conjunction with all of our AWIA updates, we should have, as a result of the risk and resiliency assessment, much better data to help inform that decision. So that's really what the federal government had in mind when they mandated that work in that way, was to be able to produce both the policy impacts and the fiscal impacts of the variety of pieces of work that were necessary to become more secure, so that councils, commissions, and others with the purse strings could make those decisions more appropriately.
And Bjorn, I interrupted you earlier when we were talking about budget and talking about the like. Did you have something you wanted to add there?
I mean, to that point, you know, that it is also a national funding issue. I mean, cybersecurity in state, local, municipal government is a really critical for a variety of reasons. The SolarWinds attack is another great one. Many state and local municipalities are still dealing with the aftermath of the Tyler Technologies breach. Excellion hit Washington State again. Write to your congressman. You know, if you are a person who has connections with your local government, reach out to them. Let them know how serious this is. Let them know that they need to be letting their superiors know, whether it's in their political party or you know, in Congress or in their federal hierarchy. Whatever it is, pass the message that this needs to be addressed and this money needs to come through, because it's needs a national program to really drive this and get behind it, and we haven't seen that yet.
And when you do it, make sure you create a record that can be referred to later on, so that if something happens after inaction, use it as a baseball bat to hit that legislator over and over and over.
Yep. And another thing that I want to talk to as well is that the risk landscape is going to be changing and getting considerably greater over the next 20 years. With the projections that we know of climate change, one of the major risks is going to be water scarcity. And that's when reservoir levels really do start to scare me. What if the reservoir levels are lying about the level of water that we have, and it turns out that we don't have enough water to keep everybody alive over a certain period of time. That is another kind of risk. You don't even need to poison the water. Just say you have more of it than you do, and you could bankrupt a water system, not financially, but in terms of having less water to give out than it needs to have. And when that might not be a risk for the rainy Pacific Northwest right now, but 20 years from now, when all this looks like Palo Alto, it might be.
Don't get people to move here that way, Bjorn.
Oh God, I shouldn't have said that.
I think it's worth pointing out that we're talking about this because human health was involved. The reality here is the vast majority of the threats that these water systems are going to face are ransomware, business email compromise, things that can put them out of business without hurting someone, but you're still going to go out of business, right? So this has brought the attention, so everybody's paying attention, but frankly, this is probably not the biggest threat they're facing. They're facing bigger threats from ransomware and all the other stuff is really what they're going to be fighting.
Well, so let's talk about that for a second. So, all right, let's assume that whoever broke into this, the system in Florida was, not a nation state. They got in, they got out. It was easy to fix. But what they've just shown is, this is not that hard to do. Have we raised the risk here of copycat attacks? Has it gotten so much attention that I know you talked about Russia, but nobody knew about that. That didn't make waves. Is this going to become a bigger thing? And is this going to become a bigger thing now?
It is. And here's what's going to happen. The next guy is going to be a lot smarter and is going to monetize this event. And he's going to say, as soon as I hit that, let's turn it up to 11,000. I'm going to kick off my ransomware so you can't change it. Right. So somebody's going to have to run out to the pump and turn the thing off to make this happen. So, and then they're going to lock down the facility, and then you're going to be pulling out your cyber insurance or your wallet or running, around with crazy trying to recover.
Somebody was asking earlier about Stuxnet, and this is your 21st century Stuxnet right there. Is ransomware is every bit as destructive and dangerous.
Yeah, but this just shows how easy it is to potentially compromise one of these systems, and the next people are the ones that are going to make money off it, not just make a statement.
Or there will be some kind of act of terrorism, whether or not it's successful, showing Americans. Everybody, the news story is out. There are Iranians using Shodan right now for real. And, I think that's, and in fact, I don't think I was looking for articles around this. Every local news station right now is going out to its water utility and going, can this happen here? So, the level of awareness has gone way up. That's probably a good thing. The fact that this has been broadcast internationally, hey, look how easy it is to knock one of these guys down. That ain't good. So chop.
It's also worth pointing out that what you just mentioned actually has happened. A couple of years ago, the Iranians did attack a water system in Israel and actually were relatively successful.
Actually, as recently as January.
Yeah. No.
And the easiest way in through vulnerabilities, through people, phishing. What's the attack surface?
Misconfiguration of remote access is probably one way in. Getting somebody to give up a password is always the easiest way.
I would say that from what our experience, the water industry faces all the common threats that every other business who's trying to mature their security program faces, and that's pretty much everything, right? Business email compromise, ransomware, crypto miners, malicious activity because people want to, make a statement, nation state work. The whole everything's open, unfortunately, because they don't have the controls in place. They're an easy target.
So we only have about 6 minutes left here.
And I want to ask Dan a question real quick too.
Yeah.
How gigantic is the supply chain for when you're building a plant? It's not 3 or 4 vendors. I mean, you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds, right?
Yes.
And this whole third-party supply chain security that's starting to reach epidemic, if I can use that, proportions, is probably got to be acute in this sector.
Yes. And generally speaking, all of those suppliers are either working towards or now have products that connect to the internet, right? In some of the most obscure ways. So it seems like every industry is working toward interconnectedness.
Mhm.
Whether, as I was just mentioning, the motor starters for a pump, which I think 10 years ago, nobody would have thought there would have been much of an advantage in being able to connect your motor starter to a pump. Well, now there's significant capabilities in being able to monitor the health of your rotating machinery. How is it degrading? How much power is it using? Using that data to make it more energy efficient. There are significant advantages involved in that, which are compelling reasons to purchase that equipment and use it or upgrade to it. There should be an equal awareness, sitting on the opposite side of that incentive to use it, of how that connects to your system and what kind of vulnerabilities that may present, and what you should do as an owner then to be able to protect yourself from that.
So
Connecting all these systems up, it makes them into a kind of a living thing. It's an ongoing self-sustaining process.
Yep.
And every ongoing self-sustaining process that can be endangered by something outside of it needs an immune system. And it needs to, have awareness of what's going on in that body. It needs to be able to feel itself. It needs to be able to see and understand itself. If you will forgive my poetic flight of fancy, and these security solutions are how you keep in touch with your body, so to speak.
Cool. So I'm going to put the survey in the chat here for folks as we, and I recognize, of course, the irony of talking about clicking on links, phishing, and then giving out a link, but such is life. Trust me, which is what every bad guy says. So I want to go around here and just, final thoughts from everybody. And I'll put everybody's email address up on the screen while they talk. So if you have questions, you can reach out to people individually. Also, my email address is easy. It's jake@ci.security. I'm vain enough to have a vanity email address. Dan, final thoughts from you.
Our mandatory work to be compliant with AWIA and risk and resiliency assessment. If you haven't done that yet, don't cut your budgets on the risk and resiliency part. If you have already done it, consider getting a second opinion on that work and asking the questions that came up today. I was monitoring the chat. All great comments. A great way to start an effective program.
Bjorn.
Make sure that you're not just buying a checkbox. Make sure that both in terms of the equipment that you buy, whether it's a firewall. When I made a comment about firewalls earlier, you really do kind of get what you pay for, and I've been seeing a lot of people underspend on older firewalls that don't have the features that they need. I've even seen water systems that are deliberately buying equipment that is too elderly to really be in support anymore, and that can't get software updates, but it's hardware that fulfills the function, so they're using it. Those are the sorts of things that really need to stop, because those are the things that create vulnerabilities. Otherwise, really be thinking about what all of the potential risks to your systems are, and be thinking about what's connected that you might not really have thought of as being a device that's on the internet that nevertheless is in communication with other things. These are all just things to think about as you go through your assessment. And then last but not least is the fact that, as others noted, this is an accelerating risk. The more opportunity that people perceive for these events, and as people have noted, when something like this happens, it makes it clear how easy it can be, and the message is definitely out now.
Yeah, and you'll remember it if you call it a watershed moment. Fred.
MFA, multi-factor authentication. Any remote connection that's connected to the internet, please start using multi-factor authentication.
Yep.
Mike, close us out.
Least expensive way you can set everyone's mind at ease is to do a focus penetration test to see if you have something hanging out there that needs to be closed up.
Yep. And the best way that you can get those weird questions asked is if you get a focused security assessment to go with that penetration test, so that you have somebody like me asking weird questions that don't seem to have anything any relationship to one another, yet actually, we bring those connections back together and walk through how these links work and what exactly can happen to your water system if somebody were to abuse them.
Cool. And one thing that I forgot is, Mike actually has a vendor questionnaire. So if you're hiring vendors, a good security questionnaire. If you email me, I can send you Mike's questionnaire too. I meant to tell you that earlier. Also, remember the survey's there. The link is real. Please fill it out. The other nice thing is, for every fill out, we give money to a food bank. So that's always a great thing. I just want to thank everybody here. This is a situation where, if we do the right things, we can save lives. So Dan, thank you. Bjorn, thank you. Fred, thank you. Mike, thank you. And have a great week, everybody. And thanks for joining all around the country here.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.